Imagine Raqefet Cave, about 13,000 years ago. Firelight flickers across the stone walls. A Natufian woman leans over a mortar filled with something cloudy, sour, and faintly bubbling. Around her, people are preparing to bury one of their dead. She raises the liquid to her mouth and drinks. A few minutes pass. The flames begin to look as though they are splitting in two. Voices cut through the cave more sharply. Laughter hits harder than it should. And when she tries to move, her legs seem to answer just a fraction too late. Was she the first human being to get drunk? Almost certainly not. In fact, we cannot know whether this woman existed in exactly this way. What remains are traces inside stone mortars, evidence suggesting that people at Raqefet were making a beer-like drink for ritual gatherings. So where did intoxication begin? With one accidental mouthful of fermented fruit or grain? Or did humans deliberately learn to recreate that feeling because ordinary food could never produce it? The first drink changed one body. Drinking together changed the group. The real mystery is not who first sank their teeth into a piece of spoiled fruit. Ethanol appears anywhere yeast can reach sugar. Fruit splits open. Sap leaks from a tree. Grain gets wet. Honey becomes diluted. Fermentation can begin without planning, without tools, without a human hand anywhere near it. An animal could consume alcohol and never understand what had happened. The stranger step came afterward. Humans noticed that this liquid could throw off balance, blur judgment, slow reaction time, and weaken the ability to protect yourself. And then, somehow, we decided to make it again. Not once, in batches. We kept it. We carried it. We handed it to other people. Why would any species deliberately repeat an experience that makes survival more difficult? Archaeology cannot recover a drunken night. That moment disappeared with the person who lived through it. What it can recover are tools, residues, containers, and ritual spaces, evidence that something unpredictable had become repeatable. The mystery is not why ethanol existed. It is why humans invited it back. Now return to Raqefet Cave on Mount Carmel near modern Haifa. The Natufians who used this place were hunter-gatherers, but there was nothing careless about their stonework. Beside a burial area, they carved deep mortars directly into the bedrock and used them to process plant foods. When researchers examined the starch residues and patterns of wear inside those mortars, they concluded that some may have been used in a multi-stage brewing process. The grain could be soaked until it began to germinate. Then dried. Then crushed. The mash could be heated, cooled, and left exposed long enough for wild yeast to turn sugar into alcohol. Picture what came out of that process. Thick, sour, weak, difficult to store. This was not a prehistoric can of beer. It was a living mixture, unstable and unpredictable, something that might spoil before the gathering even began. And the evidence cannot tell us how much anyone drank. It cannot tell us whether someone became visibly intoxicated, stumbled through the cave, or woke the next morning regretting it. But the sequence matters. Sprouting, grinding, heating, fermenting, 4 connected decisions. An accident does not need a workflow. Wait, why put in that much labor beside the dead? The drink may have been prepared for commemorative feasts, moments when food, memory, grief, and altered emotion occupied the same space. A chemical change inside a stone vessel may have helped create an emotional change inside an entire mourning community. Before alcohol became recreation, it may have helped the living move closer to the dead. Now imagine Jiahu in central China during the 7th millennium BCE. A potter reaches for a sealed clay jar and breaks it open. From inside comes a sweet, sour smell, the remains of a mixture made from rice, honey, and fruit, possibly hawthorn fruit, wild grapes, or both. The liquid is cloudy. The walls of the jar are stained. Something has been working inside it, even though no one can see what that something is. Chemical analysis of compounds absorbed into Jiahu pottery revealed evidence of a mixed fermented drink dating back about 9,000 years. And the mixture itself is important. One source of sugar might ferment by chance. But when several ingredients are combined inside a selected container, chance begins to look more like a formula. Rice, honey, fruit. Not simply food left to rot. A combination. But think about the problem facing the person who made it. They could not see yeast. They had no word for ethanol. They could not measure temperature, identify microorganisms, or write down a precise set of instructions. So how did they make the result happen again? They remembered. They remembered which jar produced the best batch. They remembered which part of the year was warm enough. They watched the surface, listened to the bubbles, smelled the liquid, and noticed the moment when sweetness began turning sharp. They remembered the scent that meant the drink was ready. And they remembered the scent that meant the entire batch was ruined. A clay jar was not merely a place to store liquid. Its shape changed how much air entered. Its seal protected the mixture. Residue from one successful batch may even have helped begin the next, whether the maker understood what was happening or simply trusted that particular vessel. This was chemistry without molecules. Microbiology without microscopes. Quality control without numbers. So were the brewers at Jiahu just guessing? No, not random guessing. They were paying attention. A successful batch became a memory. The memory became a story. The story became a set of instructions that another person could follow. One person noticed something. Someone else copied it. A third person adjusted the method when it failed. And suddenly, knowledge no longer had to die with the individual who discovered it. That is the point where fermentation became unmistakably human, when an invisible accident could be remembered, taught, corrected, and repeated. Now travel west to Abydos around 3000 BCE, as early Egyptian kingship was beginning to take shape. The brewery air would have been heavy with heat, smoke, damp grain, and the sour smell of mash. Workers moved beside rows of large ceramic vats supported by mud structures sometimes described as fire legs. Grain and water were heated inside those vessels, while people carried fuel, moved ingredients, controlled timing, and worked through separate stages of production. This was no clay jar sitting in the corner of a family home. Archaeologists identified at least 8 parallel brewing installations at the site. Researchers estimate that the complete facility may have produced around 22,000 liters in a single batch, enough for thousands of servings. What had once happened inside one container had become an organized system. Each installation measured roughly 20 meters in length. Inside, around 40 vats stood in 2 rows. Now multiply that layout across the whole facility. Raw grain comes in. Fires are maintained. Water is heated. Mash is processed. Liquid leaves in enormous quantities, on command. And scale changes everything. It requires grain collected from fields, fuel gathered and transported, workers assigned to specific tasks. Someone must decide when production begins, how long each stage lasts, where the finished beer goes, and who receives it. Supply, timing, obedience. A brewery of this size was not simply making a drink. It was showing who had the authority to command food, labor, and time. Which raises an uncomfortable question. When a ruler provides beer for a feast, is that drink a gift? Or is it a demonstration? Beer could feed workers, it could accompany offerings, it could fill royal ceremonies and public gatherings. But the same batch that nourished a crowd could also reward loyalty, display abundance, and tie that abundance to the name of a ruler. Whoever controlled the brewery influenced when people gathered, what rituals felt generous, and whose power seemed responsible for that generosity. This was not merely production. It was administration. The drink altered minds. The brewery organized bodies. Once alcohol could be produced at scale, intoxication stopped being only a private experience. It became political. Now enter the city of around 2600 BCE, where drinking could become something else entirely, a performance of rank. Imagine Queen Puabi, the elite woman buried in the royal cemetery of surrounded by gold, silver, carnelian, and lapis lazuli. Among the objects connected to her tomb was a drinking tube made with a hollow metal core and decorated with 35 alternating beads of gold foil and lapis. The end of the tube reached down into a vessel. Its length may have allowed the drinker to draw beer from beneath the layer of floating scum and fermentation debris sitting on the surface. Was it practical? Yes. Was it modest? Not even close. The cemetery also preserved lyres, clothing ornaments, serving vessels, and the remains of attendants. We cannot reconstruct one of Puabi's banquets minute by minute. But the objects tell us what kind of world surrounded her. A world where food, music, clothing, precious materials, and drinking all announced who stood at the center of power and who remained outside it. Across Mesopotamia, beer appeared in ordinary rations as well as elite ceremonies. A laborer and a ruler might consume the same psychoactive molecule. But the molecule was only part of the experience. The vessel mattered. The room mattered. The seat mattered. One person drank from a common container. Another drank through gold and lapis while attendants stood nearby. Same ethanol. Opposite message. So where did the pleasure come from? Was it inside the beer itself? Or inside the knowledge that only certain people were allowed to drink in this way? At a feast, your position could announce your status before anyone said a word. Sitting near the vessel meant sitting near the center. Precious materials transformed drinking into spectacle. Alcohol did not erase the hierarchy. It made the hierarchy visible, beautiful, intoxicating before the first drop even entered the blood. If you're still with me, hit subscribe because the next question changes what that drink in your own hand actually means. Humans did not simply share alcohol. We used it to display status, define belonging, and draw social boundaries. The cup drew the line.
But humans are not the only creatures that consume ethanol.
In Southeast Asia, pen-tailed tree shrews regularly drink fermented nectar from Bertam palms. Researchers have measured alcohol concentrations as high as 3.8%, enough that a similar exposure could affect a human. And yet, the tree shrews do not appear drunk. They do not stumble. They do not lose obvious coordination. They keep feeding, night after night, as though their bodies have simply learned to handle it. Wait, if animals encountered ethanol before humans did, does the idea of the first drunk human still mean anything? It does. Because encountering alcohol, digesting alcohol, and deliberately seeking the altered state alcohol creates are three different things. An animal may tolerate fermented food because it contains calories. A human may preserve a batch because the change in consciousness has become useful, desirable, or meaningful. And archaeology will never identify the first individual who crossed that boundary. No bone records a room spinning. No stone preserves slurred speech. No grave names the first hangover. Archaeology can only show us when humans began rebuilding the conditions on purpose. Nature supplied the molecule. Humans supplied the intention. The easy explanation is that early humans drank because rotten fruit tasted good, or because beer was safer than water. But neither answer can carry the entire story. Those first fermented drinks required valuable ingredients: grain, honey, fruit. They also required labor, containers, patience, and the willingness to risk losing the whole batch. A community could have eaten those calories directly, faster, safer, sober. So why spend scarce resources creating something that weakened balance and judgment? Imagine a ritual where everyone drinks from the same supply. At first, the group is guarded. People watch one another. Grief stays buried. Hierarchy holds everyone in place. Then the drink begins to work. Faces soften. Laughter spreads more easily. People speak without polishing every word. Grief rises closer to the surface. Stories feel larger because several nervous systems are moving in the same emotional direction. This was not simply private intoxication. It was synchronized vulnerability. Modern group experiments suggest that alcohol can increase coordinated smiling, conversation, positive expression, and reported feelings of bonding. Ancient communities did not need charts or laboratory equipment to notice the same pattern. They could see it in the room. One person relaxed, then another. One voice rose, then several joined it. Separate minds began to behave, briefly, like one emotional body. That was alcohol's unusual value. It created a controlled loss of control. Chaos, but placed inside a vessel, a date, a location, and a set of rules. The gathering began together. The drinking happened together. And, ideally, the return to ordinary life happened together. The group surrounded the risk before the individual stepped into it. That was the breakthrough. Not getting drunk, learning to surrender part of yourself without surrendering the group. Humans did not remove chaos. We scheduled it. Now look at the drink in your own hand. A glass raised at a wedding. Champagne opened after a promotion. Beer passed around after a funeral. Someone leaning across the table and saying, One more drink, because the honest conversation has not happened yet. You may think you are choosing a flavor. Often, what you are being offered is permission. Permission to speak louder. Permission to stand closer. Permission to say what daylight, hierarchy, caution, or embarrassment normally keeps locked behind your teeth. Not courage, borrowed permission. And that exchange is ancient, less personal control in return for a stronger feeling of belonging. Sometimes the trade works. A stranger begins to feel familiar. A stiff room loosens. A difficult memory becomes warmer because everyone crossed the same emotional threshold together. Then the same mechanism turns in the opposite direction. Lowered caution becomes reckless judgment. Repetition becomes expectation. Expectation becomes dependence. The ritual that once belonged to a wedding, a feast, or a single difficult night begins demanding every night. The chemistry does not care which direction your life takes. It can connect and isolate. It can reveal and distort. It can soften fear and create danger. That is why a shared drink can feel comforting and unsettling at the same time. You are not just swallowing ethanol. You are entering a social agreement about how much of yourself you are allowed to release and who will still be there when it happens. Every shared drink asks the same ancient question. How much control will you trade for connection? Now return to the Natufian woman beside the stone mortar. The cloudy liquid still touches her lips. The fire still splits inside her eyes. Around her, the community stands in that narrow space between the living and someone who has just become the dead. She does not know yeast exists. She does not know ethanol is changing the signals inside her brain. And she cannot imagine that 13,000 years later, humans will raise glasses in bars, palaces, churches, stadiums, and kitchens after midnight. But the pattern is already there. Drink to remember. Drink to belong. Drink to become, for a little while, someone less guarded. Across millions of species that consume sugar and thousands that encounter fermented food, humans did something different. We turned a natural toxin into a recipe, then a ritual, then a commodity, a status symbol, and an invitation. Not merely chemistry, culture. We built celebrations around it and warnings around it. We used it to welcome strangers and separate classes, to honor the dead and escape the living. The same chaos could connect or destroy, soften or expose, unite or divide. We never conquered fermentation. We never made it harmless. We simply gave its chaos a place inside human life. And once we did, entire social worlds grew around those brief moments when the mind became something else. We learned to bottle the accident and call it culture. Subscribe